Hello, everyone. Welcome to Restaurants Canada webinar, Foodservice Facts 2021, Putting the Pieces Together. My name is Roberto Sarju, Director of Marketing and Communications here at Restaurants Canada, and today I'll be your moderator. Really excited about this one today. Despite the setbacks and challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the industry has been resilient, innovating, embracing new technologies, and exploring new revenue streams, which I'm sure many of you who have been on this webinar today. In this webinar, we'll hear from Restaurants Canada's very own metalhead economist, Chris Elliott, as he takes a deep dive into the 2021 Food Service Facts report and answers such questions as where we are in the recovery, when do we expect to see restaurants recover, what does the industry look like after recovery, how will takeout and delivery change? And that has changed the game. But as people start dining in, what's happening? What are the top menu items Canadians are interested in ordering? I wonder if chicken's going to be on that list. And from forecasting to market research, you'll learn how to reach your consumers and win in today's competitive food service market. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, you can put them into the Q&A section in the bottom right corner of your control panel, and we will try to get to as many as we can at the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available within 48 hours of the webinar, and so will the actual deck itself. Now, with that said, I'd like to introduce the man himself, over 20 years of doing food service facts, bringing us the industry's straight facts, if you will. Chris Elliott. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Roberto, and thank you everyone for joining. I know we're all very busy, but I'm honored and really proud to be here to talk to you about our latest food service facts for 2021. Over the last 18 months, we've seen the devastating impact of the pandemic across the entire food service industry. COVID-19 has disrupted the daily lives of the 22 million guests that would normally visit our restaurants every single day. It's created havoc for the 1.2 million Canadians that rely on the food service industry for employment. And it's also led to the permanent closure of more than 12,000 food service establishments across the country. And all of this has had a ripple effect across the entire food service landscape, impacting food service suppliers, distributors, manufacturers, and farmers. Just moving forward here. The theme for this year's Food Service Facts is all about putting the pieces together, that it's like a puzzle that we're trying to figure out. And just as an aside, one of the interesting trends that came out of the pandemic was the surge in demand for board games and puzzles as kids and adults were looking for new forms of entertainment. One company was selling 20 jigsaw puzzles a minute across North America, seeing a 400% increase in sales. And they really said it best. Puzzles are all about bringing order to a pile of chaos. What a great metaphor for everything that we've been going through over the last 18 months. And since the start of the pandemic, food service owners are trying to bring order to this big pile of chaos. And we've seen an incredible amount of innovation as food service operators look for new and sometimes unconventional ways in order to put the pieces back together again. So in today's presentation, Roberto mentioned it, I just want to cover off sort of the three big questions that I get asked pretty much on a daily basis. And the first one is, where are we in the recovery? Because depending on which province you're in and which segment, you're at a different stage of recovery. And as part of this section, I'll also talk about that recovery in the day parts between breakfast, lunch, and supper, as well as what we're seeing in on and off-premise dining. From there, we're going to move into when do we expect to see restaurants recover. So I'll be talking about our most recent food service sales forecast, but as we get into this recovery, we're also seeing some new challenges emerge. So I'll be talking about menu pricing, food costs, as well as labor shortages. Finally, what does the industry look like after the recovery? And certainly this is going to be a big topic that we're going to be looking forward to, and so I'll share our thoughts on that. And finally, we can't have a restaurant industry forecast and outlook and not talk about food. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the top menu items Canadians are interested in ordering. So let's dive right into the presentation and talk about where we are in the recovery. Sometime over the last 18 months, or if you attended last year's webinar, you might have come across this chart showing the decline in commercial food service sales. And if there's any media on here, just in terms of what commercial food service represents, we're including full service restaurants, quick service restaurants, caterers, and drinking places. And last year when I gave this presentation, I said that the food service industry had essentially fallen off a cliff and broken both legs. That this was not just a survival situation, that this was now a rescue operation, and that we were going to need support from government. Overall, food service sales fell from $6.3 billion in February 2020 down to just $2.5 billion in April of 2020. This represents the lowest food service sales in more than 2 decades. And as a result of this, we saw the loss of more than 800,000 food service jobs who were either left unemployed or were not working any hours. That represents 2 out of every 3 workers in the food service industry that were impacted by this decline. Now, since then, we have seen a bit of a partial recovery, but it's been certainly a very uneven recovery. I've often compared this to my heart rate monitor every time I go for a run, where you just sort of see these big jagged ups and downs. After that big initial decline, we did see that recovery, at least in the summer of 2020, as we saw a decline in cases and patios started to open up. But as you can see, we still were impacted in the second wave as well as in the third wave. Even as early as May 2021, food service sales here were down 30% compared to pre-COVID levels. But as you can see, with the reopening of Ontario, more patios opening up, food service sales have now climbed to about $6 billion as of July 2021. And this represents about a 5% difference between where we are now and where we were prior to COVID. Just to put this chart into perspective, overall retail sales in Canada returned back to pre-COVID levels back in the summer of 2020 and are currently running about 8% above where they were prior to the pandemic. So quite a difference between the experience that we've had in the food service industry and what we have seen in the retail sector. So as I mentioned, we're about 5% below pre-COVID levels, but it really depends on where you are in the country. In some cases like Ontario, which was really late in reopening, food service sales were down by 9% compared to pre-COVID levels. That compares to just -3% for Quebec and a 1.9% gain in Manitoba. Over in Saskatchewan, that is not a typo. Food service sales in July were up 9.1% above pre-COVID levels. But again, these are July numbers, and if we were to have the numbers today in terms of what's been happening, these numbers would be much smaller for both Saskatchewan and Alberta just because they've been hit so hard by the 4th wave. At the other end of the country, we have Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia, which saw significant declines in July, and this is largely because of the delayed reopening of borders. So New Brunswick was much earlier in opening its borders, and so their sales were only down by 1.2%. But what I have heard is that sales were much stronger in Nova Scotia and PEI in August, and in fact, it was actually a very strong month for both provinces. So definitely very different depending on where you are in the country. But it also depends on which segment you're in. Overall, full service restaurants and drinking places were certainly hardest hit at the initial stages of the pandemic, with drinking place sales down by 90%, largely because there was no type of takeout, no delivery at the time for these types of a restaurant, as well as patios weren't open, and many of these were closed either temporarily or in some cases permanently. We did see the recovery in that summer months, like I talked about, with patios opening up, but then being hit quite hard by the second and the third wave. And even as of May, full service restaurant sales were down almost 50% compared to where pre-COVID was, and drinking places were down closer to about 65%. But the good news is we have seen a rapid bounce back, and again, largely because of that reopening of patios, the warmer weather, decline in cases, and this has definitely been a strong improvement. By contrast, quick service restaurants, although seeing a decline, were not impacted as much, and this is largely because they could rely more on the takeout side of their business. At its worst, sales were down by 40%, but you can see that sales quickly recovered near pre-COVID levels, even as early as September 2020. They were impacted a little bit by the second and third waves, but certainly not to the same extent that the other segments were at. And one of the most amazing things is, as of July, quick service restaurant sales were right back to where they were prior to COVID. So definitely a strong recovery in the last couple of months. What we're seeing here really comes down to that comfort level of Canadians. So back in September, we looked at a survey and we asked Canadians what they were most comfortable with. And clearly, these are the areas that benefited quick service restaurants the most. 94% of Canadians felt comfortable getting takeout from a restaurant, and 88% felt comfortable getting food from a drive-through. And sort of that next tier of comfort level is eating on patios, which were comfortable for 76%, and patios for quick service restaurants at 66%. Where we start to see that concern from Canadians is once you start moving indoors. So that's 76% of those that were comfortable eating on patios at a traditional restaurant dropped to 65% when it comes to eating indoors at a traditional restaurant. And it's the same drop for quick service restaurants, which declined from 66% down to 49%. And in terms of areas where they're least comfortable with, it's eating inside a food court at a mall or going to a bar. It's just one of those areas that they feel least comfortable with. We had conducted the study again, just to repeat these numbers, in April of 2021, and we really didn't see any difference, but I wanted to use this one just because it really does illustrate the impact of patios and how crucially important they are for food service operators. And out of that survey, we also found that the segments and the areas where it's going to take the longest to recover are in the food courts and going to bars. So it's going to take time for that type of recovery to happen. And ultimately, the goal for restaurant operators is to make people feel as comfortable eating indoors as they are with drive-throughs and takeouts. And again, that's going to be part of that education component. That's going to just take time to do, but eventually we are going to get there. But when we look at this, it becomes very clear how it's affected the share of dollars spent by on and off premise at quick service restaurants and full service restaurants. In the 12 months ending April 2020, quick service restaurants, about 32% of sales came from dine-in, and that dropped to just 9%. And for full service restaurants, which usually 80% of sales comes from dine-in, that number dropped to just 45%. And that figure would be even lower had it not been for patios. When it comes to off-premise, everything grew in terms of market share. But the most popular way that people were trying to order out from restaurants was with takeout, up 41% from 34% and up to 36% for full service restaurants. And then we have drive-through. For full service restaurants, very small because there's only a few types of establishments that offer this. But from the quick service restaurant side, this number jumped to 38% of overall dollars spent. And if we look just specifically at traffic accounted for about 50% of all, or drive-through accounted for 50% of all traffic at quick service restaurants in the 12 months ending April 2021. So an incredible amount of market share just through drive-throughs. Keeping in mind that not every restaurant has a drive-through. And finally, one of the biggest elements that came out of this pandemic is the rise in delivery. Of course, both quick service and full service restaurants seeing a rise in the number of dollars spent. Overall, delivery jumped by 55% in the 12 months ending April 2021, representing nearly $7 billion in sales annually. So again, a lot of growth in just that one component. When we look at the numbers, overall, nearly 8 out of 10 Canadians have ordered delivery from a restaurant in the past 6 months. And it's really split almost evenly between ordering at full service restaurants and ordering at a quick service restaurant. But when it comes to the different demographics, it's certainly the younger generation. 9 out of 10 18 to 34-year-olds have ordered delivery from a restaurant in the past 6 months. And that compares to just 67% of those 55 years and older. And that delivery can be from telephone delivery, using a restaurant app, or through third-party delivery. So we wanted to ask Canadians why they chose food delivery in the first place at a restaurant. And for the vast majority, it was either because of they want that convenience and that it saves time, and 44% saying that they just didn't feel like going out. But for 37% of Canadians, they wanted to really support their local restaurants because on-dining premise dining wasn't available in their region. And so we saw a lot of people wanting to go out and support their local restaurants. And certainly this was just one way that they could do that. And finally, 1 out of every 5 Canadians was choosing delivery because they felt it was just safer to have food delivered than for them to go out and try and order through any other mechanism. So different reasons for this, but one thing that people could agree on was why they wanted the restaurants and why they ordered delivery. Overall, 73% of Canadians said that food quality is consistently good as the most important factor when they order delivery. And this is something that you're going to see carried through this presentation as well. What we saw through the pandemic is a lot of restaurants getting into delivery for the very first time, and so they had to re-engineer their menu and re-engineer the packaging just so that that food quality could be consistently good when it comes to delivery. Demographically, older generations, such as those 55 and older, they generally wanted food from restaurants that they visited before in person. They didn't want to take a chance on a restaurant that they'd never been to, with food that was unfamiliar, even a restaurant that was not familiar. They wanted to go to places where they knew what the food would be like. They didn't want to take any chances. And so this was the most important category for them, that they wanted familiarity when they ordered from restaurants. By comparison, when it comes to the younger generation, those 18 to 34-year-olds, they were most focused on the value conscious. They were looking for delivery from a restaurant that offers great value for money, but they were also looking for food where there was no delivery fee or low delivery fee. So it really came down to those economics in terms of why they chose and the most important factors when they choose an order delivery. And finally, just because this has been such a stressful crisis, 6 out of 10 Canadians said that they were looking for items that they craved. And this is where we saw strong gains in terms of chicken sandwiches, hamburgers, those types of comfort foods. So all of that had led to very strong growth in these types of categories. As I said at the beginning, the pandemic has really disrupted the daily lives of pretty much every Canadian. Canadians were working from home more often, kids had to stay home, and so that really had a direct impact on traffic to the different types of day parts. If we look at full service restaurants, morning and lunch traffic, really at the beginning of the crisis, was down by about 75% on a year-over-year basis. We did see a little bit of an improvement in the third quarter, but then with the second wave and the third wave, traffic is still well below where it should be, just because of that decline in on-premise traffic. People are not commuting as much, and people are working more from home. So all of that has affected full service restaurant traffic for morning meals and lunches. The same is very much true for quick service restaurants, but certainly not to the same extent. We did see that drop off in morning meals and lunches, much like what we did with full service restaurants, but we are seeing a bit of more of a recovery when it comes to the first quarter of 2021, where we're now getting into single-digit declines in terms of overall traffic. It's interesting to note that despite the fact that we do see more people working from home right now, morning meals is still actually recovered a little bit more than the lunch category. But when it comes to supper and PM snacks, so this would be your afternoon or evening snack, again, we see a little bit more of a recovery from here, from minus 50% to about minus 22%. But it's at quick service restaurants where we've seen the biggest improvement. Even as early as the first quarter of 2021, supper traffic and PM snack traffic is virtually back to pre-COVID levels. So this is part of what's been driving up quick service restaurant sales over the last 18 months, is that recovery in supper and PM snack. And it's still a ways to go for full service restaurants and PM snacks. And a lot of this, again, has to do with that commute and people working from home rather than going on to the office and having those power lunches, having that breakfast on the way to work, having that snack in the office. And it's going to be a big question in terms of how soon that returns back to normal. For those of you that live outside of Toronto, this photo is a picture of the underground path. It's in the financial district here in Toronto, and it really connects a lot of these different buildings underground. I was here in March of 2021, and what I saw was very quiet, a lot of temporarily closed restaurants. And then I took this photo about a month ago, and this is at noon when it should be jam-packed full of people. And although there were more people than what there were in March, the one thing that I've noticed more than anything else is the number of permanently closed restaurants and other retail outlets that did not exist there before. So even in this photo alone, there's about 4 different places that have closed down permanently. And it really goes to show that a lot of operators, whether the restaurants or even on the retail side, are thinking that it's not going to be anytime soon that we're going to see that recovery where people are coming back downtown to congregate like they used to. Some of the studies that we've been watching is that 25 to 30% of the population in Canada will continue to work at least part way from home some days over the course of the rest of the year, and that they're going to continue to work partially at home even into early 2022. So it's going to take some time when we're starting to see these types of buildings fill up again. We see those offices fill up again. But what has happened is it really has transferred a lot of that spending that would take place downtown and moved it more towards the suburbs. And unfortunately, I wish I had StatsCan data to prove that, but it's something that we are hearing anecdotally, that a lot of that spending that used to take place in restaurants downtown is now taking place in the suburbs. One of the biggest challenges, though, even though we are seeing those improvements in sales and certainly not back to pre-COVID levels for most operators, but that restaurants are still not profitable. Overall, nearly 6 in 10 table service restaurants are operating at a loss. And overall, 44% of quick service restaurants continue to operate at a loss. So even though we saw sales improve in July, at that same moment, we were still seeing restaurants operating at a loss. And this is largely because we see those continued rising costs such as food, labor, and other expenses. At the same time, they're operating at half the capacity in some cases. They're not seeing that improvement in tourism. They're not seeing that business dining. And so as a result, 8 out of 10 restaurants have gone into debt because of the pandemic. And for the vast majority of them, it's going to take 12 months or longer to get out of this. And if we have a 4th or 5th wave at some point, this is the time where a lot of operators just may throw in the towel because it's just not worth going through it. They're just going to continue to lose money, and it's a struggle for many of them. So it's important to put into context that even though we have been seeing some of those improvements in sales over the summer months, that food service operators continue to struggle operating at a loss and continuing to pad on more debt. And so this is why government programs such as the wage subsidy and the rent subsidy are so vitally important for food service operators. It's the only way that we're going to get back to that 1.2 million employees that we did before COVID. So of course, the question that then comes up is, so when do we expect to see restaurants recover? And certainly in talking with Canadians, they love restaurants. And 9 out of 10 said that they enjoy going out and eating at a restaurant. And that same 9 out of 10 say they're looking forward to going out to a restaurant with friends and family again. And 64% said that restaurants will be an important part of their everyday lifestyle. This goes to show there is that pent-up demand, there is that love for going out to restaurants and spending time with friends and family. So this is certainly very important, and they're looking forward to getting back out again to restaurants. So when we forecast food service sales, we look at that sentiment, but we're also looking at economic indicators such as GDP, disposable income, the unemployment rate, as well as the different lockdowns that take place. And from there, we are able to forecast food service sales. Now, this forecast was done about 3 months ago, so we will be updating this soon. And at the time, we were not predicting a 4th wave. So just take that into account as we look at these numbers. But if we look back in the 4th quarter of 2019, quick service restaurant sales were getting about $8.5 billion in sales, dropping to about $6 billion at the worst of the pandemic, and then really plateauing at around the $7.6, $7.7 billion mark. At the time, sales have gone up to $8.1 billion, and I was expecting that net sales would climb to about $8.2 billion, but in fact, we may actually see quick service restaurants returning back to pre-COVID levels already. If that's the case, then this number will be certainly higher, and depending on what happens with this 4th wave, if we start to see those shutdowns like we've seen before, that would have a direct impact here. But at this point in time, it's likely that we're back to pre-COVID levels here, and that will continue on going forward in terms of seeing that growth in sales. By contrast, table service restaurants or full service restaurants have a much more rocky road of recovery. We go back to 4th quarter of 2019, we had sales of $8.7 billion, dropping to just $3.2 billion in the 2nd quarter of 2020. We see that pickup again, talking about the patios opening up, relying more on delivery and takeout, as well as a decline in cases. But then we see the impact of the 2nd and 3rd waves, so food service sales plateauing about $5 billion. Now, we had forecasted 7.3 billion for the third quarter, and this actually may be underestimating what we may actually come out to see. So we saw some very strong growth in July, August, I've heard great things, and September as well. So these numbers may actually be a bit stronger. But where I get into wondering about is this fourth wave, and this could have a direct impact on the 8.1 billion. So we may actually see, if not flat, possibly a little bit lower sales in the fourth quarter. But what I do feel more comfortable and confident with is that by the time we get to the second quarter of 2022, that full service restaurant sales will return back to pre-COVID levels. It just really depends on what's happening here, especially with the fourth wave. So overall, with food service sales, we saw sales decline from 77 billion to 55.1 billion. A little bit of a recovery here in 2021, but again, this is such a weak first half of the year, and that's going to be followed by a much stronger second half of the year. And so we see that full impact of annual sales in 2022, where food service sales are expected to grow to $80 billion. Now, it's important to note that we're just talking food service sales here. If we're talking traffic, it's not likely to be until 2023, perhaps even 2024, that we start to see that full recovery in traffic. This is again because people are starting to get used to working at home, and many want to continue to work from home even after the pandemic is over. So it will take time for traffic to recover. Another big unknown is tourism and how soon doors will open and how many times, how much when Canadians and other international visitors will start traveling across the country. So we will see steady gains after that, but again, it's going to take a little bit longer for traffic to return to pre-COVID levels. And if a pandemic wasn't enough to kind of get you interested in what's happening, we also have other challenges. And one of the biggest ones that we've seen, certainly in the last few months, is the rise in food costs. For restaurants, back even in the second quarter of 2021, fresh vegetable prices, cooking oil prices, beef prices were some of the areas that they saw the biggest increases. But they also saw higher prices for poultry, dairy, and then some other commodities. And in terms of the other, they saw rising packaging costs, rising PPE costs, and so all of that is putting more pressure on restaurant operators at a time when they don't have a lot of profitability to work with. And in fact, many are losing money. So we had asked restaurants, how are you choosing to absorb these prices? Or are you raising menu prices? And how are you dealing with this? And certainly there's a mix of responses. As we saw during the minimum wage increase in Ontario, there was just no one set way and no one way to sort of solve this problem. And so it's really going to be a mix of absorbing either partially or fully the increase in the food costs or raising menu prices. We see some operators removing the items from the menu for 35%. I'm actually happy to see this number here, that a lot of operators are not switching to lower priced ingredients and that they're not reducing portion sizes. This goes back to the delivery component where people are consistently looking for food consistency. They want good food quality, and this really plays out here. And I was talking with a couple of operators that had switched to lower priced ingredients. And of course, the backlash from social media was very evident. It did not go over well. And so I'm often reminded of a conversation I had with Don Ardour from Mildred's Temple Kitchen. And it really comes down to, if you have to go to single ply toilet paper in order to save money, then you need to do that. But don't cut back on the butter that makes your signature dish. And we see that's really what's happening here. People are looking for other ways to try and either absorb them, other expenses that they can cut, but they really don't want to cut the value because that's so important to our guests right now. So in terms of what the outlook looks like for menu prices, it's really all over the map. You have about 12% of operators that are saying, we're going to increase our menu prices by anywhere between 1% and 2%. At the other end of the spectrum, you have 15% of operators that say, we're going to increase our prices by 7% or more. And with some table service restaurants, I'm hearing the prices could go up 10, 15%, just based on all the cost pressures they're facing. But overall, nearly 50% of food service operators said that they're going to raise their menu prices by 4% or more. And this is in an industry where typically menu inflation runs between 2.5% and 3%. So this is a significant increase, but again, operators are trying to pull the line in terms of how much they can pass on to customer and really trying to absorb as much as they can. They don't want that sticker shock for their customers. So all of this is really kind of a short-term supply disruption. But then we get into some of the longer term issues, and certainly job vacancies is probably one of the biggest ones. During the second and the third wave, what we saw is that job vacancies in the food service and accommodation industry were back to pre-pandemic levels. So even though a lot of restaurants had not fully reopened yet, the job vacancy levels were already back to pre-pandemic levels. And then as these start to open up and we see more restaurants opening up, we've seen a skyrocketing number of job vacancies. The latest numbers for July is showing 133,000 job vacancies across Canada, and again, largely in the food service industry. These are record numbers that we've never seen before. So it's just astonishing what's happening right now. And so when we do surveys of operators, we're finding that 80% said that they're finding it very difficult to hire back of house positions. This could be cooks, chefs, dishwashers, kitchen helpers as well. And nearly 7 in 10 are having trouble filling front of house positions. This even includes servers, which are typically easier to fill than other positions, but they're having trouble finding servers, they're having trouble finding counter attendants as well. So this isn't just a full service restaurant problem or a quick service restaurant problem. This is affecting the entire food service industry. Part of this is really a combination of a number of factors. You have many people that used to work in the food service industry, and due to the uncertainty of how long restaurants will be open, they've moved on to different occupations outside of food service. There may be some case where we have the disincentive to work because of government social safety nets. But the one area that we're not hearing much about is demographic factors. So 15 to 24-year-olds typically account for about 43% of all of food service workers. But what we've seen is that as a share of the overall population, 15 to 24-year-olds went from about 20% of the population down to just 12%. There are fewer 15 to 24-year-olds today than what there were a decade ago. And at the same time, not only is there fewer of them, but fewer are also participating in the workforce. They are postponing going into the workforce because they are focusing on their schooling. They're looking for that volunteer work. They want to work in sports or do something else. So they're really putting off that first-time job experience. And so it's really this double whammy of smaller population combined with the fact that fewer are entering the workforce in the first place. And this is having a dramatic impact on food service operators as well. And this is not a situation that can go away anytime soon. We're not suddenly going to have a bunch of 15 to 24-year-olds coming in and back to that 20% number. And so restaurants are going to continue to struggle, at least over the long term, in trying to find these workers. And so they're looking for different ways to try and attract labor. And part of it is offering benefits such as health or dental, free meals. In cases where they can afford it, they're increasing pay. But again, when you have those low profitability numbers or lack of profitability, these are very hard things to do. One area that we have seen over the last couple of years is this rise in the number of those employees that are 65 and older entering the workforce and entering the food service industry. So maybe we start to see that change in that composition from a lot of young people working in the industry to older people working in the food service industry, because we can offer those benefits and the flexibility, free meals, and the flexible work schedules that they would want as well. So this is one area where we're going to continue to see a challenge. So the big question, of course, is, okay, we get through all this, what does the industry look like after the recovery? 97% of restaurant operators made some change to their business in order to survive. That's just 3% that said, you know what, our model works, we're not going to make any other change. But for the other 97%, they made some change to their business. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but some of the ones that I wanted to pull out, that 70% had changed their hours of operation, 54% had streamlined their menu. They didn't want to have all that inventory. And so I'd seen, going into a lot of restaurants, the shrinking of menus, focusing on some of those key items that the restaurant is known for, those signature dishes, and rather than trying to be all things to all people. We also saw increased use of social media. This is a very social industry where people like to connect each other, and restaurants connect with their guests inside the restaurant. But now that's moved to a more virtual platform. And using social media doesn't mean just advertising today's special, but also engaging them and sharing recipes and how to cook, as well as that transparency of this is how we're keeping you safe, and this is how we're keeping our employees safe. So social media has become a very powerful platform to add to that transparency to what restaurants are doing, not only inside the restaurant, but also in terms of some of the other deals that they're offering. Nearly 4 in 10 are adding new technology, and part of that is also coming out of the fact that we have a labor shortage, and so technology is going to be a big component to try and overcome that. One of the more interesting elements that came out of this is that 18% began selling meal kits and 13% sold groceries. Before we get into this, I just want to go back and just say that when we've talked with operators, the vast majority of them plan to maintain or keep these changes in the long term. So there is no going back to the way that things were before. So the vast majority of them are going to keep a lot of these changes. But I do want to talk about these meal kits and groceries because when it comes to 18 to 34-year-olds, 36% are either somewhat or very interested in buying groceries from restaurants, and 40% are interested in buying meal kits that they can purchase at a restaurant and then prepare at home. One of the big things that's happened throughout this pandemic is this huge pendulum switch back to food service. So prior to pandemic, what we saw is that grocery stores were starting to look a lot more like food service. We saw that rise in grocerants, and they were selling more grocery-oriented or restaurant-oriented foods. But because of the pandemic, that pendulum has switched right into the other direction, where now restaurants are starting to look a little bit like grocery stores, selling different grocery items or selling meal kits. So it's one of those really unique changes that's happened because of this pandemic. And overall, 76% of restaurant owners agree that Canada's food service industry has been forever changed. Accepting that this has changed and that the world has changed is going to be what really drives a lot of the growth for those restaurants. And the industry has changed, and probably one of the biggest areas that's changed is this off-premise. Delivery is not going to go away. Off-premise dining is not going to go away. This is something that's going to be here in the long term. And so when we ask Canadians, what is their preferred way to order takeout from a quick service restaurant? 27% said it's through drive-through, 26% said go inside and pick up. But if you combine delivery together, that's 1 in 5 occasions where they want to order delivery, or 1 in 5 Canadians that would want to order and prefer to order delivery. But you notice that 2-to-1 split between those that want to order delivery through the restaurant versus those that want to order delivery through that third-party service such as Uber Eats and Skip the Dishes. So just take a mental picture of this in mind, and then I'll go to the next slide because we're going to just focus on the 18 to 34-year-old categories. We see quite a difference here. We combine those two delivery categories, and it is the #1 way for young Canadians, 18 to 34, to order from quick service restaurants once the pandemic is over. It just nearly beats out going inside and picking up, and drive-through at 24%. The other thing to highlight here is that 2-to-1 split in terms of preferring going to the restaurant delivery, either by phone or through an app, and Skip the Dishes goes away. It's nearly tied. So there is a preference not only towards delivery, but when it comes to 18 to 34-year-olds, moving more towards the Uber Eats and the Skip the Dishes. It's a very similar trend when it comes to full service restaurants. So when we took all age categories together, about 39% said that they want to go inside and pick up. But then we have this delivery, very high at about 30%. And again, you see that 2-to-1 split between ordering delivery through the restaurant or ordering delivery through a third-party service. So again, take that mental picture of this, and then we move on to the 18 to 34-year-olds. This hasn't changed much, but we can see delivery is much more important to the 18 to 34-year-olds. And again, that split between ordering directly from a restaurant and ordering directly through a third-party delivery service, that gap narrows significantly. So the future is off-premise. And so there's some really exciting concepts that are coming out. You may have come across this Burger King concept in the United States where instead of having one drive-through lane, we start to see this multiple drive-through lane, not only for the guests, but a third one strictly for third-party delivery. We have walk-up windows. We're shrinking that on-premise side of the business. We're putting more emphasis on patio and outdoor seating. So all those numbers that we've been talking about today. All of this is changing the way that restaurants interact with their guests. And it's not just Burger King. Taco Bell, same type of a concept. Multiple drive-through lanes, food comes down in these conveyor belts, shrinking that on-premise side of the business. If there's room for a patio, they'll do that as well. But it's to remove a lot of the bottlenecks that can occur when you have just one single lane for a drive-through. So all the numbers that we've seen and that preference towards drive-through, through takeout, through delivery, all of that is going to be part of these new concepts. Now you're probably thinking, well, what if I don't have a drive-through? Not a problem, because restaurants are now also ripping out walls so that they can have these windows that you can just walk up to. And so you don't have to go inside the restaurant anymore. And I'm seeing more and more of these cases here in downtown Toronto where there used to be a window or there used to be a wall there, and now they've got this pick up and carry out window. But you may be thinking, well, what happens if I don't have a restaurant? Well, there's ghost kitchens as well. And so this is another area where we're starting to see quite a bit of progress on. So prior to the pandemic, roughly 4% of food service operators had a ghost kitchen. And we were expecting to see that that would increase over time. Current survey that's in the field has that number closer to about 7%. So we've seen some incremental increase in terms of going towards ghost kitchens or virtual kitchens. But what was interesting is that 26% of food service operators aren't sure if they would expand into it. So it does show that there is some openness to going towards these open kitchens or these virtual kitchens. What's happened is with this, there is that cost savings and economies of scale, so you don't need that expensive real estate in the downtown core or in a building. Now you can have it in a much less expensive place. You don't need all that overhead, and certainly there's a cost savings associated with this. The one thing I would caution though when it comes to ghost kitchens or virtual kitchens is we have talked with Canadians, and 8 out of 10 Canadians that are 55 and older and 6 out of 10 that are 18 to 34 want to order delivery and take it from a restaurant that they can normally visit. So there is a little bit of that apprehension towards going towards ghost kitchens. They want to be able to go to a restaurant and order food from a restaurant that they're familiar with and that they can visit in person. So there will be some education involved in trying to convince Canadians that the food that you would order from a delivery from a ghost kitchen is no different than the food that you would get at a restaurant. So again, exciting changes are happening in the industry. So just to summarize, this is all the things that we've seen, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the top menu trends that we're seeing. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list of every menu item. You'll see some of the items that are most popular in the food service facts, but I did want to highlight some of the things that we've seen come out of this pandemic. And one of the things that stands really out more than anything else is just that desire for local. 9 out of 10 Canadians want food from a restaurant that's sourced from local farms or Canadian produced. We saw Canadians that wanted to support their local restaurant, which is a great thing. And now it's also showing that they want restaurants to support local farmers, which we do as well. Other areas where we saw a lot of interest in is comfort foods. We talked about pizza and chicken sandwiches and iced coffees. Those are all the comfort foods that people are familiar with. But then there's that comfort food with a twist. So maybe it was a gourmet grilled cheese sandwich or a turkey meatloaf, something that they was familiar, but at the same time different from what they're used to. And if the pandemic has brought about anything, it's just that health and wellness is so important. And so this continues to be key areas where people are looking for a food that's natural and unprocessed or raised without antibiotics. Going down a little bit further, you see this meatless vegetarian entrees and plant-based burgers and sausages. Back in 2020, when we did our chef survey, it was the plant-based burgers and sausages that was the top menu trend at Canadian restaurants. And really that hasn't changed. It's still very popular, but still what we see is that growth towards local. But if we do focus on just younger generation, those 18 to 34-year-olds, nearly 50% said that they're interested in ordering these types of meals. whether it's the vegetarian, vegan, or the plant-based burgers and sausages. So it is skewed more towards the younger generation than the older generation. And then another area where we see a lot of interest in, especially from young people, 40% said that they want a meal subscription where customers can sign up to get meals during the month for pickup and delivery at a discounted price. A lot less interest in those that are 55 and older, so this is why it only averages out to about 28%. But the meal subscription could be another alternative in terms of engaging with your guests. So in summary, overall, quick service restaurant sales are forecast to return to pre-COVID levels around the fourth quarter of 2021, although I think that already happened in Q3. And it'll probably be about another month before we see those numbers from Stats Canada. Overall, total full-service restaurant sales are forecasted to return to pre-COVID levels around the second quarter of 2022. I feel very confident with that number, but I do believe that it's going to be a little bit of a challenge over the next couple of quarters just because of the closure of patios, and that fourth wave in certain provinces could delay some of the sales recovery that we see over the next 6 months. And finally, the food service industry has been changed forever. Certainly impacting delivery, the off-premise side, and ghost kitchens, which is something that we will see some growth in. So in summary, at the beginning of this presentation, I showed you that this incomplete image on the cover of this year's Foodservice Facts. And as we put the pieces together, we're going to get closer to that final image, and eventually we're going to get there. And certainly Restaurants Canada is here to help you put the pieces together. But my caution is that we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. There still is a lot of uncertainty out there. This pandemic is not over. And even if it was, we still have issues to deal with, whether it's pricing or labor shortages or paying off debt. And we also know that the situation can change rapidly. And so we have no idea what could happen around the corner soon. The one thing though that I have learned, and Roberto mentioned my 20 years of experience in the industry, is that this is a very strong and resilient industry, and there continues to be a lot of innovation. And based on everything that we're seeing, and especially some of those new concepts, I'm actually quite excited about what will happen and what's the future of the industry is going to look like. So I think that in the end, we are going to come out of this a bit stronger and a much better industry, despite the fact that we are still in the middle of a pandemic, still dealing with a lot of challenges, but we are going to be stronger and more resilient than ever because of this. So on that note, hopefully positive, thank you so much everyone for tuning in today. I really do appreciate it.
That's awesome, Chris. Listen, that was a lot to take in, but so insightful. Thank you so much for sharing. Once again, I just want to remind everyone that if you do have questions, please enter them into the box in the lower right corner of your screen, and we'll get to those in a sec. But just wanted to share a couple of insights I took away, and lead to my actually first question for you. But man, it's interesting how that 18 to 34 demo really flips everything on its head in terms of what we know about the industry. That kind of leads to what I wanted to ask. How much buying power does that group have in the food service industry, and what kind of hold do they have on us as an industry in terms of what we do next?
So in fact, they have an incredible amount of buying power. This is a generation that loves going out to restaurants. This is the Gen Z millennial category. And we had even seen, even prior to the pandemic, that this were the two cohorts that were really driving up food service sales into 2018, 2019. They love going out to restaurants. They love the experience of restaurants and trying new foods. And of course, the idea that they want to be able to go out, take a photo of the food, share it on Instagram, and be the first ones to do so. So they are the ones that have really driven up a lot of the sales. But it really depends, and the reason why I split out some of the different age groups is because there are those restaurants that do cater to an older audience. And so again, it's not that one size fits all, that you have to know who your guests are to find out what's going to work for them. Because you may have a younger generation that really loves the technology side, but it may not be the solution for all restaurants if your demographics are 55 and older, for instance.
That's a great point. And I wanted to touch on that about the different age groups and the technology and the fact that the future is, like you said, the future is off premise and we'll continue to see that growth. I think that's so important for everyone to realize and to know that, how do you cater to that and the importance of knowing who your target market is for your restaurant. That's going to be so key in any next steps that you do take. We've had a few questions coming in here now, which is awesome. So I want to start with this one first. On the cost inflation slide, when you're talking about your forecasted sales growth, how much food cost inflation is factored into the forecasted sales growth, or at least its impact on restaurants?
Great question. And it's one that does come up because now we're trying to dissect between what the sales growth is and break it out into those components between how much of that is traffic growth and how much of that is menu inflation. We are using our Outlook survey as that guideline in terms of menu inflation and what we expect. So it'd be about 4% of that growth in sales would come from menu inflation. It's also important to keep in mind that we've also got higher average check sizes too. So that makes things a little bit more complicated. So when people have been going out to restaurants, because they haven't been going out as often or they miss it, the average check size has increased over time, especially for that supper category. So that again is having an impact on overall sales, even if we don't see that full recovery in traffic.
Awesome. Next question is there any concern? You talked about increase in average check size in that last question, but is there a concern about the impact of the shrinking disposable income as interest rates rise, housing gets more expensive, or and is that more susceptible to the full service restaurant?
It's actually been the opposite. Even what's happened if we go back prior to the pandemic is those rising housing prices led to a wealth effect, which actually led to stronger food service sales growth in the last few years. And because of the pandemic, we actually saw a huge increase in household savings. People had cut back significantly on their spending. They weren't doing any type of major trips or travel. And so they accumulated billions of dollars of savings. And we also saw that increase in disposable income through government support programs. So in fact, there's a lot of pent up demand out there. There's a lot of pent up savings. And so that's an area where we are expecting it's going to filter into not only quick service restaurants, but to full service restaurants as well.
Perfect. The next question I want to ask was in regards to actual, in regards to actual tourism. You talked about the recovery timeline going into 2022, 2023. One of the biggest factors of that is tourism. What impact does international travel into Canada have on food service?
So because I've worked on the industry for these years, I do have these numbers in my head. So international tourism represents about 4% of overall food service industry sales. And the latest forecast, and this is in the Foodservice Facts from Destinations Canada, is that international travel isn't going to return back to pre-COVID levels till about 23 at the earliest, but it may go as long as 2025, depending on where we are with this sort of global vaccination rate, where we are with this virus. So there is quite a window in terms of, could it be 2023? Perhaps, but it could go longer. But certainly that would impact especially those tourist destinations, the Niagara Falls and other parts of the country which rely solely on tourism. That's going to be a problem. And so hopefully Canadians can continue traveling within Canada to help prop up those sales. But it will take some time for the international visitors to come back.
And we've started to see a lot of that. You see some of the airlines, talking about travel within Canada and promoting that on an ongoing basis. So that goes to my next thing about supporting local. One of the things that I saw that you shared was that people want to support those who support local, which is fantastic. And I think I know that I've seen from a marketing standpoint, more and more brands showing that on their menu, more and more brands saying that we're using, Alberta beef or Canadian milk or, whatever that is to continue showing that they're supporting, the Canadian supply chain, if you will. Any thoughts, insights on that?
Your observation is exactly the same as mine. Just walking around and walking through restaurants and seeing what's on those menu boards, and the amount of focus and the attention that is now part of that marketing is the food that we're using comes from local areas. We're supporting our local farmers, and it's not traveling as far, so there's that sustainability issue that's involved as well. All of that combined together is something that's it's a win for restaurants as well as for the farmers.
For sure. Um, let's quickly segue to grocery stores. I remember doing this webinar with you now, I think 4 years, Chris, as we've been doing this together. And we always talk about the blurring lines between restaurants and grocery stores, and especially when it comes to prepared meals and meal kits. And now, you shared that that 18 to 34 demo is really interested in getting that from restaurants, maybe versus the grocery stores. So can you shed some light on really what's going on there?
What's happened, and there was examples that I've used in previous presentations where there's a slide and it shows an Italian restaurant, but you walk through the front doors and it's all freshly made pasta, freshly made sauces. And so this goes back to the idea that people want to support local. And even if they can't eat in at the restaurant, they do love the food, and they were thinking, you know what, we can buy these types of foods from the grocery or from the restaurant rather than go to a busy grocery store where there's long lineups and everything else. So there's that safety element where maybe they don't feel as comfortable going into a grocery store, and we did hear a lot about that. They felt more comfortable and safer going into a restaurant and getting their groceries from there. And so I think that's an element that restaurants have really picked up on, that they can supply not only the restaurant meals, but also go into the category of groceries. And we've talked with restaurants that have done this, and they said, the majority of them said it actually sold better than expected. And this is something that they're going to continue on using even after the pandemic subsides. So there is another alternative source of revenue that maybe didn't exist a few years ago because we didn't have to really think about it. But now this is a new area where they can try and sell these goods. And I think that's another way to support local restaurants.
Let's talk quickly about technology and optimizing restaurant operations. What role do you see owner and operators see technology? And, have you seen in terms of what types of technology that they're doing? I know that there's increased costs, but are you seeing anything that they're doing to offset some of these costs and to help return to potential profitability?
Certainly, the technology side is one of those lagging areas for the food service industry. It's something, again, in previous presentations, I've been concerned about is the lack of productivity in restaurants compared to other industries, just because we haven't seen that rise in technology. Again, if anything positive can come out of any of this, it's that it starts forcing restaurants to start considering things that they wouldn't. So technology can certainly be used as a labor savings item. It's definitely something that can help in productivity. But at the same time, you have the other side of the equation, which is the guest. So it's trying to find that balance between what can I use as cost savings and what can I do to make sure that the guest is happy. Because as part of our food service facts, and I think this is in our discerning diner as well, is that Canadians, once the pandemic is over, is still go towards ordering food from a restaurant from a server. That it's not just coming through on a robot or sailing through on something else. They want to order food and have that interaction with the server. So there's certain areas where it could take some time for restaurants and customers to become more familiar with the technology side. But having said that, I was walking down Spadina Avenue on probably about 2 weeks ago, and there was this little robot that was carrying food down the roadway. I'm not sure how it's going to work in the wintertime if you've got 3 feet of snow, but certainly it's an area where, as part of that delivery side, we are seeing people being testing out this model. And so that may be one of the first areas where we start to see a lot more technology used.
Well, that's so exciting for this industry. And like I think, like you said, Chris, this industry is incredibly resilient, is incredibly innovative. So, I look forward to doing this next year again to see, what has changed. But that, it is 3 o'clock. I don't want to take up too much of more of anybody's time. That does bring us to the end of our Q&A. We've had some phenomenal questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted and who we were able to get to. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Restaurants Canada on your preferred channel, either directly through our phone or social or email, however you wish to get in touch with us. Just a reminder, the full Food Service Facts 2021 report is available for all Restaurants Canada members in the member portal, or actually check your mailbox. It's already been mailed out to you. If you're not a member, please contact us and learn how you can get your copy for yourself. And Chris, I believe will be seeing you on the big stage at the RC Show 2022, February 27th to March 1st.
Full on metalhead performance on that one.
Looking forward to that. And so just a heads up, exhibitor spots are filling up fast. Attendee registration will be opening soon. So get in touch with us to learn more how you can take part. But once again, to everyone, I want to thank you for taking your time today, spending some time with us. The recording and the deck will be available within 24 to 48 hours. You will be getting an email for that. And Chris, thank you for sharing your great insights with us. And thank you for spending your time and sharing your knowledge today.
Thank you so very much, everyone.
Thank you, guys, and enjoy the rest of your day, and please stay safe out there. Take care. Bye.